morning or good afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. This is Liu Yuyang. I'm grateful that at the invitation of Politecnico di Milano, Professor Mascotelli, to have this opportunity to share some of our works from my very early years, shortly after I graduated from the graduate school until quite recent, span of almost 20 years of work, what we titled as linearity and lineage. And in a while I will explain the title of the talk. To begin with, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to visit Italy last year at the invitation of Professor Bucci and Professor Mascotelli to be part of the Mantova architettura program and spend almost a week in Mantova. And I think that led to a further exchange with the professors there and to discuss about my work. And subsequently, at the end of last year, with a book published titled Architecture in Shanghai, History, Culture, and Identity. And the very articulate article written by Professor Luigi Spinelli on my work particularly, with the very precise title, The Linear Element, the relationship between tradition and design in architecture. And I think in this article, which is a good reflection, I think for me, because it's something that I've been working with for the last 20 years. But I think through an outside perspective, especially from a European or an Italian perspective, looking at my work with the emphasis in Shanghai, it's a very sobering, I think, opportunity to revisit some of the past conditions, the interests as architect, as well as some thoughts for the future. And I hope my sharing will also help the students and the audience to get a better understanding of how we, as contemporary architects, dealing with a fast-growing city like Shanghai, deal with the tradition and design in architecture. A bit of where I started from. I was born in Taiwan. In the mid-80s, I immigrated with my family to Singapore. So really this began the kind of path over the years, a path of migration into US, to the West Coast. And in the 90s, I moved to the East Coast of the United States, starting my graduate studies in architecture, as well as the beginning of my professional career in New York. And that's a time when, as a third-year graduate student working on the final thesis, I had the opportunity to study with Rem Koolhaas. Of course, I don't need to further introduce him. But in a way, I think that encounter, a very intense 1 year of research with Rem, started much of what I've been working on in the last 20-some years. And I think we started with, of course, his book, everybody knows, The Deliveries to New York. But then also how he kind of looked at that condition of cities in situation like Shenzhen in the mid-90s as a kind of phenomenon of urban growth, a kind of situation that we need, we as architects need to find a way to understand and to get a better perspective of how we can operate in such a situation. The result of the research culminated into a book called The Great Leap Forward, which took about 4 years in preparation, and finally in 2001, it became a publication that came out in the US and Europe that looked at the overall kind of growth and infrastructure and the kind of ideology and politics behind the working of the city, or I should say cities. So in this case, each city is matched with a keyword. For example, the overall Pearl River Delta is related to the infrastructure. Shenzhen as a city is both ideologically driven and, of course, architecturally driven. Guangzhou, as the capital of the Delta, was mainly defined by its political position and the kind of overall policy. Zhuhai, on the other side of the Delta, was mainly a city of landscape. And Dongguan, which is a manufacturer base, is largely driven by money or finance. So Shenzhen in 1996 was a city that's already been quite developed, but it was only a short span of less than 20 years. So this is a planning map of 1980. We can see that time there's barely anything except a large master plan. It runs east and west along the border of Hong Kong, and it developed from east to west, starting with Luohu, which is the border kind of entry point between Hong Kong to Shenzhen. And from mid-90s onward, for the next 15 years or so, the city really evolved along what's called the Central Corridor, as well as northward, center to the northeast, to the northwest. So it really started to sprawl, but at the same time, it maintained a very linear kind of growth pattern, with the central cluster always maintaining the kind of major investments and major infrastructure of the urban development. And this is the master plan of Shenzhen in the last decade, from 2010 to 2020. And we can see there is a kind of doubling of this development corridor from the east to the west. And we have the second development corridor, again, paralleling the first one, again, running from east to west. And all the north-south developments were sort of secondary or supplementary to the two main linear developments. So that's what really defined the city as a kind of top-down infrastructural planning kind of strategy. But at the same time, in our research, we were also very much interested in the ground condition, the kind of hyper-density, the kind of vast growth of buildings of different scales, and a term that came up during our research, or as a result of our research, city of exacerbated difference, precisely portrays this kind of situation where cities of this region were in a way not necessarily in the kind of coordinated effort as in the classical urban development, but much more in a kind of competitive and a kind of hyper sensitive to the micro changes of the various places. The slightest modification of any parts required adjustment or readjustment of the whole to reassert the equilibrium. So, and to put it in a more straightforward sense, we can see in this case high rise against the rice fields as a very kind of a startling contrast of the urban situation there. So it's kind of the agricultural and the hyper-urban in the same image. And in this case, along the east-west major street or major highway, we have situation like miniature Eiffel Tower as a very surrealistic situation, a theme park that takes all the landmarks of the world and makes it half scale and placed along a completely new terrain to make a new culture, a new urban condition. The result of our research, before it became published in a book, it was shown in Documenta 10 in 1997 as one of the first urban research that was exhibited in the contemporary art show. In year 2000, just as the book was coming to an end, I made a move, a reversal migration to Hong Kong, and that's when I started a series of teaching and research based in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the Department of Architecture. And one of the major researches that I was conducting under the collaboration of the department and the KCRC, the Hong Kong Kowloon Rail Station, Rail Corporation, is called the Linear City Research. And that's really the beginning of this very strong interest on my part about infrastructure and urbanism, and especially infrastructure in a kind of linear situation. And in this case, we were looking at not the sort of core of Hong Kong, not the central part, which is already heavily developed, but the suburban situation in Hong Kong, which requires still a lot more stitching between the neighborhoods, between the major residential buildings. And then in this case, it was a industrial neighborhood that is evolving into more commercial and real estate and residential. And the rail station, as a current situation, was making a separation between the different neighborhoods. So in this case, the idea was to develop a kind of new form of rail station that will stitch the different parts of the community and to make it a new kind of public space that is not just about transport but also about events and space. And this was an image showing a kind of new infrastructure added to the original station and to elevate the public space so that it becomes a new kind of infrastructure of urbanism, and to separate different layers, the transport layer, the community layer, the programmatic layer, and the landscape layer. And this is a kind of a visualization of a new form of rail station integrated into the industrial neighborhood with the new residential neighborhood coming up, and to really find within the tightness of the existing space a new form of urban space, both above and below the infrastructure. In 2007, as an interest to develop a more focused architectural practice, and to also be able to start with some smaller projects, I made the move to Shanghai for several reasons, of course. The culture, the history of the city, of course, the kind of beauty of the river and the waterfront, that is somehow different from the hyperdensity of Hong Kong. I think that's what attracted me as an architect. And in that sense, both the history from the colonial past, it had a period in the mid-19th century to early part of the 20th century that had a lot of foreign influences, European, American, as well as a kind of new urbanism, very much in the form of high density, high rises, very progressive thinking in urbanism that are coexisting across the major river that runs through the city, the Huangpu River. And also, there's a deeper kind of historical culture, the culture of what we call the Jiangnan region or the south of Yangtze region. That's very much in the sort of DNA, the cultural DNA of the city. And this is something that's very much Chinese, very much of this overall region that had started human settlement as early as 7,000 BC, and is very much affected by the landscape, by the environment, by the water, extensive water networks, beautiful small-scale wooden architecture, stone bridges, and so on. So the sort of water village culture, not unlike some of the water towns in Italy, for example, like Venice. So there is a culture of using water or being close to water in this part of China. But of course, as architects, when you're in Shanghai, there's actually more opportunity to build in a generic suburban situation like this, which one could say is similar to many parts of China, different sort of second tier, third tier, or even fourth tier cities in China. So you have these three situations coexisting in the city of Shanghai, both the very historical and hyper-modern metropolis, the very sentimental water town, water village situation, and as well as a very kind of generic suburban situation. And I think those kind of feeds the notion of how an architect operates. That is to say, not just picking one situation, but able to respond to different urban situations. So we start, fortunately, we were able to start with some early projects in downtown Shanghai, and over the years start to migrate to different locations within the larger Shanghai metropolitan area. So just to orient everybody, this is the major international airport, the Pudong Airport. So people coming from Europe, you'll be most likely landing in this airport. And there's a second airport, Hongqiao Airport, with the high-speed rail, very extensive kind of infrastructural complex of airport, high-speed rail, subway station, bus station, and shopping malls, and so on. The Hongqiao Hub, which actually, in terms of its urban context and or kind of impact to the city, it's much more interesting and creates lots of potential. So many of our projects were situated because of this new transport hub. And to begin with, some small projects in the city center. Our first built project, this was actually before I moved to Shanghai, the Shanghai Museum of Contemporary Art, Shanghai MoCA, which is situated in the middle of the city, in the park, beautiful landscape area. So that was done in 2005. And after I moved here, one of the first very small projects, series of pedestrian kiosks, the Nanjing Road pedestrian kiosk, which was probably one of the first kiosks in China that were designed by architects, because before this, most of these kiosks were done probably by some manufacturers or designers who usually do these product designs, so on. So I think it was safe to say I was one of the first one, or maybe even the first one, to have done these kiosks. And proudly to say, it's probably also one of the most long-living kiosks. It still exists on the street of Nanjing Road to this day, so over 10 years now, as most of them in many other places we have seen, they last no more than a few years and usually gets replaced by something else. So, and to begin with, the street is one of the most popular kind of pedestrian streets by visitors, both in Shanghai and across from China. All would come here and to experience or to kind of enjoy the kind of shopping and the history of Shanghai. And these kiosks forming altogether 12 service points, but as well as also information points and the kind of signage and kind of iconography of the place. So the challenge was to satisfy different programmatic needs. In this case, we have kiosks that sells tickets, kiosks that sell products. But this was a particular time of the Shanghai Expo, prior to the Expo. So the Expo organization had a few kiosks that they were selling the souvenirs, but also there were banks, there were tourism information booths, telephone booth, so on and so forth. When public phones were still in use. These days, I think there were very few of these telephones, but the kiosks were there. And there was even one designed for the Museum of Contemporary Art as their kind of a showcase windows. And so it started with two simple prototypes, that of the hexagonal. And so with the hexagonal type, you have this particular case, a kiosk that has human, a person selling the tickets, as well as a bank machine in here. You have a kiosk that's purely of the bank machines. And then you have a kiosk purely for selling lottery and so on. And what's important in this series of design is the kind of a basic motif of the square glass blocks that was designed by us and produced with a local fabricator. That's reminiscent of the kind of Art Deco era, but that's not trying to be historically kitsch. So in a way, it relates to history, but it's also about contemporary language. And the second type was the oval type. So with a simple bend in the detail, the window or the facade detail, that we were able to create all the parts were the same except the angle of the connection, the metal connection. So we're able to create the second type in order to have a different visual kind of interest without adding to additional cost. And in this case, we have the Madame Tussauds Wax Museum showroom as a very particular and very popular kiosk. And we also have one at the end, which is a combination of ticket selling information booths as well as a bank machine. So all these different shapes, programs, services along otherwise a very kind of chaotic and busy urban streets form a kind of consistent language and consistent iconography along the street that relates to the history and also relates to the daily street life. Shortly after the project, or even during the project of the kiosk project, we start to get commissions outside the city. We start to have a project in the suburb. In this case, it's the city of Qingpu, which is about an hour away from the downtown Shanghai. In a site that used to be a kind of very typical rural village land that had been planned to be a new suburban town, and there's a green area within a water canal that's been designated for a public building, in this case an environmental station for the Environmental Bureau to test the environment, to test the water and so on. but also at the same time to activate this area because it's still very much under development. So the government needed to put a series of public buildings there first to initiate the growth. And the idea is to develop the building as a form of a kind of a viewfinder, a form of kind of catcher of the natural elements, both in terms of the kind of scientific aspect and also in terms of its kind of poetic quality. So these were conceptual models taking images of the local, the site nearby or site around. There's water, there's fields, open fields. And the project takes on idea of a series of rectilinear boxes that slides in and out as almost kind of a environmental kind of apparatus. And within the kind of sliding in and out, a series of courtyards were created and views are framed. But of course, it's not just the poetic quality that we need to pursue, but also the real environmental aspect. So in this case, we were looking at technology like passive sun shading, the kind of growth of plants on the wall, and as well as a kind of a geothermal equipment that we can take advantage of the geothermal kind of resources to reduce energy consumption. So both passive and active ways to make it a sustainable building. It's one of the first sustainable public buildings in that district. And with a very simple and I would say low budget approach to the project. So in this case, mainly use very strong color paint and very simple form of concrete kind of spaces to create a sense of arrival. This is the entrance canopy. And through these kind of openings that we're able to connect directly with the environment, and a series of ramps that would take the people up to different levels. And at the upper level, the second level, you have a series of walkways that connect the different research blocks and office blocks. And because of the level differences, we're also able to create some visual interest from within the interior of the space. So, and at certain junctures, the idea of capturing views or viewfinders became a kind of embedded idea within the daily kind of life or daily working of these people, this government staff who work in this building. And at one end towards the water canal, there's an elevated volume that was added actually in the middle of the design. There wasn't in the brief in the beginning, but during the design, often new requirements came up. In this case, was a canteen for the staff. So it was an elevated volume that goes right above where the boat, the environmental kind of sensor boat would be parked. So in this case, it's literally a capturing of nature, this kind of canal water into the site. And this is an exterior facade facing the south, facing kind of a future street. And in a way, in discussing with Professor Mascatelli, he referred that there is a very interesting similarity or reference to Turani, the great Italian rationalist Turani. And I said to him, yes, Turani was one of my favorite architects, modernist architects. During the time that I was a student, I made a point to visit some of his buildings in Como. And last year, after I did the workshop with Mantova Architettura, Professor Mascatelli also took the time to bring me back to Turani's building again. So in that sense, the idea of history or idea of tradition and design, it's also cross-cultural. So it's not just limited to the city that one works in, but I think it's a whole kind of growth and learning of history in architecture that could be across different cities, different countries, or even different continents in this case. So speaking of environment, in 2010, 2011, when the environmental monitoring station was just completed, I think that's when I begin to see a interest or a surge, a beginning of a kind of concern about environmental aspects in Chinese cities. So in this case, I often show these two contrasting images of a typical water canal. On the right hand in Shanghai, actually not far from the building that I shown, about half an hour away. So that's why the government set up that environmental station in order to improve the water, the air, the soil, and so on, to be able to monitor and improve. And the image on the left, it's a water drainage in a suburban area in Los Angeles that I happened to visit a few years ago. And so to see this too, one can see both in the kind of metropolis area, but through a different approach to water and to the way we treat waste, one could generate very different results of the quality of the environment. And so that brings us to the next set of projects that has a very direct kind of impact to the environment, or to the problem of environment. And in this case, the waterfront Ita Park, in an area that's used to be a kind of industrial or logistic waterfront. You could say some of the situation was quite polluted because there were factories and so on. But at the same time, the city is transforming into new residential areas so quick that they don't even have time to remove all the debris from demolition of earlier villages and so on. So in this particular case, we have new housing behind, and we have a new kindergarten coming up, residents moving in, kids starting to go to school, but you still have piles of these demolished construction debris left on the foreground. And it's been there for actually a number of years, and to a point where you already have vegetation growing on it, and the pressure was mounting to from the residents to request the government to do something about this. And at the same time, you still have cement factories with the cement trucks going through this area all the time. So it's a very much a undesirable situation. And as architects, we were actually asked initially to do a master plan research on this entire strip of waterfront area of about 8 kilometers long, together with 3 other teams, to look at what the kind of future possibility of the planning would be, because there's already a bigger master plan that designates this whole waterfront as a future kind of green spaces and more ecological spaces. And when this particular project came up, it was at the kind of urgent request of the local government to see if we could turn one particular problematic site from currently a kind of pile of industrial or construction debris to a community park. So the situation is such that you have the residential neighborhood to the north, but then you also have different industrial factories surrounded in the south, and actually taking up some of the best part of the waterfront spaces. And with the middle side as a phase one sort of buffer zone. So we came up with the idea of somehow reutilizing the existing construction debris, because they were, after the research, it shows that they were non-toxic materials, or most of them were non-toxic, and they were things like bricks and rocks and pebbles and earth and things like that. They were from the demolition of the nearby villages, excavation of new buildings, so on and so forth, that they were being piled on this site for a few years now. So the idea is we take them and put them in a kind of modular Gabion basket, and to transform them into a sort of new landscape, if you will. And that also serves as a park. So this is a view from the kindergarten across, and looking at the potential site for intervention and the factory beyond. And so the initial idea was to look at the whole area, not just the initial pilot site, but the whole area as a large kind of infrastructure of walls, of these kind of Gabion basket walls that could block the industrial pollution, or the kind of industrial development, and retain the kind of residential area, at the same time to allow the transformation of the larger green area into different sports and leisure grounds. And but also I think it's interesting that if you look at the images I shown here, these were really the kind of ideas that we had about drawing references from even more ancient and sometimes even exotic cultures, in this case the Mayan pyramids, as a very primordial kind of forms of stacking these large stones. So it's almost a kind of monumentality kind of quality to it. So we want to transform the idea of waste into a kind of monument, and also drawing my personal interest in land art, to have this kind of large scale pieces on the land to really show a source of kind of majestic kind of landscape as an idea. So very quickly, with these two renderings and the first kind of concept model of this particular pilot site, that the government gave the go-ahead and to start the project right away. And so it's a fast-track project. And sometimes I think in China, in our experience, the fast-track projects usually is beneficial, because it puts everybody in a very strong focus to get on with the project, and to be able to kind of focus the energy into building it and to get the results. So of course we learn a lot during that process. So in this case, it was the construction of the Gabion basket wall. So the basket came in a very lightweight metals, and then the local workers had to source all the debris out. It's a heavily kind of labor intensive way of construction, but there's also beauty in the kind of handwork in the most rough way of piling these rocks into the basket. And once the basket is set in place, they would not move. So the idea is that once you have this wall, you can then put all the existing debris inside the wall as well. So it becomes a kind of retaining wall of the debris at the same time of the industrial kind of development on the edge, and as a separation of the industrial kind of area from the residential. So this was shortly after the construction. We can see the green start to come up, and very quickly this became a more lush area. So on one side, facing the cement factories, we had this almost embankment-like form, and the plants start to grow. And within the park, a kind of topographical approach to the land was introduced, and to create a kind of various kind of interests, sort of vantage points of viewing, meandering through. But the real purpose is to really retain all the previous earth that's on the side, but just to reshape them or reform them into a undulating topography that allows people and the neighborhood people to come on to start to enjoy the space, to turn a wasteland into a community park. And in this case, we retained a few of these concrete passages, both as a way to give a stability to this long wall. This wall is about 200 meters long, and it was about 5 meters tall from one end, because the topography of the land was going up as we formed them. So one end was 5 meters, the other end was 3 meters. But the top was a continuous horizontal line and intersected by these concrete kind of gateways into the future. So this is where the future development of the green space will go. So we retain these openings. And within the park, we also had opportunity to create some areas of people who can rest. So in this case, there is a elevated square, almost like a kind of a fortress on top that people can view the rest of the park. And this is a path from the street onto this area. And at different vantage point, it almost feels kind of surrealistic, kind of both from the past and something very abstract. But of course, the most important thing is still creating something for the people. So in this case, we have a playground that's at the high part of the park, and kids and the neighborhood the parents will come. And also we have a playground at the lower part, which is next to this this mount of underneath of which is the existing earth, but we play a new layer of grass and landscape, and the kids were really able to be engaged with the landscape, be engaged with the nature. Of course, this in this case is a second nature. It's a nature that's been reinvented. And speaking of a kind of nature reinvented, we also starting to work a lot with kind of urbanism that needs to be reinvigorated. In this case, what we call urban regeneration. In the last 6 or 7 years or so, in Shanghai in particular, or in many big cities in China, has gained a new focus or new attention of doing projects that are in the center of the city and trying to take on certain industrial spaces that formerly were production spaces, and then needs to be reintroduced as commercial space or cultural spaces. So, and of course, this is a phenomenon that the Europe is very familiar with, because it has gone through the kind of generation of modernist urban development, and then to kind of regenerate the old city center. But this is sort of the more recent phenomenon in China, as there was a lot of fast urban development in the last 40 years, and now it's beginning to revisit some of the early developments of the last 20 years. And in this case, it's a factory area not far from the Hongqiao airport hub that I mentioned earlier. It's about 10 kilometers north of it, and actually happened to be in a green area next to a major expressway connecting Shanghai with Beijing. So the first toll area was next to this site. So sort of the gateway into Shanghai, but in a very kind of industrial and generic way. So all this you can see is the kind of residential neighborhood on one side of the highway, and this is the highway toll booth. So once you get out of this, you're into a more suburban Shanghai, and then eventually following this highway, you can drive to Beijing after 12 hours or something. And this was a part that's retained as a green area with some existing villages, and some existing commercial area, and this kind of industrial compound that was built in the 90s. So it actually wasn't very long ago, but already been decommissioned as factories and waiting for new investment or new intervention. So in this case, this was the model that shown the completion of the project, which we took basically the existing footprint of the building and kept the main structure, but completely redone the facade and added a number of kind of roof elements in both the phase 1 and also phase 2. But more importantly is to relook at what goes on in the gut of the building, inside the building. So this is, you can see the street view of the building in contrast with the existing commercial building just outside of it. This was the building before we renovated the original condition, the exterior and the interior. Of course, it's much more impressive once you go inside. It's got like 15 to 18 meter height and about 20 to 30 meter span. Very majestic space. And also, of course, it has also a small office block, a very generic 3-story concrete frame building. So idea is to look at all the program within. That's no longer just industrial, but a combination of exhibition, of teaching, of office, of culture, and so on and so forth, commercial programs that would make it a more vibrant type of mixed-use space within this industrial frame. This is the existing facade that we basically sort of completely took apart and redesigned into something actually much more opaque and quieter. So we left smaller window openings and to allow larger kind of surface area of the wall, but really to create a new type of space within. So on the outside, it becomes quieter. It didn't have all the window openings and so on, because all the light will be reintroduced from the top, as well as from the ground. And because it's also a very deep size, so we wanted to create this kind of gallery-like kind of space into the deep factory building. So in this case, very exaggerated scale of the openings along the long side of the facade, but also opening up the top. So this part was actually taken out from the original facade, but creates a kind of recessed glass canopy area to make it much more transparent from the third floor looking out. And a entrance using one of the existing columns, this concrete column, as a form or iconography to the industrial heritage, but also to create a kind of curiosity about what goes on inside and the kind of entrance defined by its past, rather than creating a new entrance. Of course, it's a new entrance, but all the language, all the material is from the past. In this case, a small, or I should say, a compressed kind of entry into which there's the interior kind of courtyard that's much taller that you will see in a bit. So this is the backside of the building, where we again completely took apart the existing walls and reclad it. In one end, we reclad it with a translucent gridded kind of structure to allow the light to come through. But on the other side, on to the right side of it, we completely re-expose this concrete frame, because we convinced the client that they didn't need the space necessarily, but to actually create this kind of open landscape structure that celebrates the industrial quality at the same time allows the space to be much more open and fluid. This is the inside. But like I said, the most important thing is actually to inject new program and new spaces into the kind of gut of the building. So you can see how large the scale of the building is by seeing this car. This is the SUV that was parked inside the factory while during the construction, and you can see all the very lightweight steel frame was added. This was added to the inside, so we were able to create 3 floors, or you can say 3 times the original space in terms of floor areas. And by using translucent polycarbonate materials, we finished the inside corridors with this kind of panels that allows the space to be further subdivided. At the same time, we bring the natural light into the space to really make it pleasant workspace or exhibition spaces. And every floor of the corridor, we had this internal skylights that allows the light to be penetrated all the way down to the ground floor. And also all the vertical circulation were placed in the middle of these pathways that it becomes really the kind of internal street, a linear internal linear movement, linear elements that allow the vertical and horizontal circulation to happen. So this is going to the middle floors that you can still see the light coming through, and all the way to the ground floor. And so this kind of internal skylights were really effective in terms of not only have the quality of light, but also to have a consistent kind of visual language, both from the facade to the interior. And this was the internal green corridor that I mentioned. Once you came through that compressed entrance area, suddenly you were exposed to this vertical glass elevator and the vertical internal green street, if you will, green courtyard, that brings the different parts of the building together within. So it really is kind of create a separate world from outside, and to create a new energy within. And this is a view from the next to the glass elevator. And there were other parts that we kept a lot of the original materials and just make very simple upgrades to retain the kind of roughness of the space, but at the same time just to enable the new movement to happen. And there were even parts that was not completely installed, but we had the design, for example, a vertical circulation that worked with a light well, or a new light well introduced, but that became a circular kind of a circulation well, so the stairs installed, but then some of the details still waiting for the occupants to complete. So in this case, the skylights was done, and the space was waiting for future life to come in. And by the time we finished, actually all the spaces were completely rented out, and has been quite a well-received kind of a new cultural and artistic and exhibition and co-working compounds. And what's interesting is also that not only we were able to complete the one big parts of the factory, and then there's a phase 2 of the project, which consists of a 3-story building that we were able to add 3 more floors to it, and became a kind of support building that has its own kind of vitality and own kind of program of a series of creative offices and living quarters within this building. So the two kind of coexist and have a dialogue to each other in a very interesting way, thanks to this sort of industrial kind of heritage that we were able to preserve and transform and became a new kind of identity or vitality within an otherwise very generic neighborhood. And I think towards the last few years, as we begin to be involved more public infrastructure project, I think our attention turning back to the city center in 2016, we were fortunate enough to be invited to work on a major part of the Shanghai Huangpu River reconnection project. In this case, the East Bund Riverfront open space design. So it's a project that lasted altogether about 3 years. Started with the master plan and ended with a series of bridges, waterfront connection spaces, and the ferry station. In this case, I will introduce the waterfront connection part of the project. So it's right in the downtown, in this part of the Huangpu River. So as we can see, this is in the government's plan to revitalize segment by segment, both the left bank and the right bank, or we say the west bund and the east bund of the Huangpu River. So the most kind of historical part of Shanghai is in this area. And then Pudong is just across. Lujiazui is the high CBD. So you can see this big red. It's completely kind of urbanized. But at the same time, you still have lots of different segments that's still part industrial, part commercial, part residential. So all together, from one end to the other end, in terms of linear length, it's about 21 kilometer long. And our project was in this sort of the first kilometer, what's called the Minshen Wolf. And this is as an existing situation. It's a series of industrial buildings that dated from 1905, built by the British, and all the way until the 1990s, as a series of storage spaces or production spaces that have been decommissioned some like 10 years ago. So it's been left empty for 10 years. And we were asked to master plan it, as well as to make the first set of design to reactivate the waterfront. But before we reactivate it, we need to think about the connection. In this case, you have this canal that's running to the edge of Huangpu River that cuts off the pedestrian connection from this part into our site. So one has to go around and actually walk along a road for automobile and to go across. So it becomes very inconvenient for the public to access the waterfront. And of course, not to mention, there's completely nothing except for a formerly industrial dock of this waterfront. So the first task was to very quickly make a design for a bridge. And of course, the speed is not just in design, but also in production, in manufacturing. And the bridge was made in a off-site factory, in this case, actually a shipbuilding factory in Jiangsu province, and shipped down via this crane boat from the Huangpu River and installed it by the boat. So that way it kind of saves time in terms of installation and manufacturing. So within about a year, this was done and it was placed onto this canal. It's a 60-meter span. And with the bridge, in our design, we create this kind of a two-level arch, one going up and the other going down, which is one is for the pedestrian to have a view of the waterfront and the city, and the idea of kind of going up to have a better kind of view. And then the one going down is for bicycles. As we understand, of course, the bicycle slope has a very specific requirement to allow the bikes to ride through the bridge. And the difference between the two forms a triangulated kind of truss structure that happens to also support both sides, both the up ramp and the low ramp, and creates a particular interest to the bridge. as this kind of split design. And once we get onto the site, we also had to work with the flood control wall to make a space that somehow behind the wall that one is utilizing the residual space and to make it into like steps and a more intimate kind of urban landscape. And this is looking from the bridge into rest of the dock area. Of course, this image shows that the design of the dock already had been completed, but this is showing the dock before the design. So in this case, a very majestic kind of silo building with industrial kind of warehouses and these structures showing the transfer conveyor kind of belts, a structure of the conveyor belts back then when this was used as a dock area for all the shipping activities. And this is showing the other side, the other end of the wharf area with the ferry station, existing ferry station, which also came under our project, as part of our project to redesign and to renovate it. And so the whole project was a kind of linear layers of different kind of lines that we define on this side of almost 1 kilometer long. So altogether some 900 meter long. The first layer we have along the waterfront, the kind of path at the wharf level. And then we have another layer which is 2 meters above, a kind of elevated level. And then we have these kind of various kind of pedestrian, bicycle, and jogging path. And then we have the elevated connected bridge that try to cross these ferry station. And then finally, we have also the kind of planter layer that will have to be placed on top of the wharf because we cannot penetrate the wharf. We cannot do anything to break the structure of the wharf. So it's kind of a layer over layer over layer of these kind of linear elements. And this showing the overpass bridge under construction. You can see how it's almost like doing a heart surgery, about kind of bypass of these lines across the various conditions. In this particular case, there's also a underground subway tunnels being dug right at this juncture, so it becomes incredibly complex to add these elements while all the other infrastructure are ongoing. And behind these were all the contemporary recent real estate development going on in anticipation of this area being, I would say, one of the most vibrant future neighborhoods of Shanghai. So this, you can see the new connection paths kind of going into some of the original structures supported by new columns, and some of the existing concrete structure also had to be reinforced. And this is a process showing how the new steel bridge is being added to the existing kind of colonnades that used to transport goods. Now we're developing or redesigning to transport people. And you can see the reinforcement of the original structure. The reinforcement being this steel, very heavy gauge steel plates to brace them. And then the bridge is supported by these kind of lightweight cross bracings that's partly connected to the concrete columns and partly kind of connected to the steel part. So so the underside of the bridge presents another kind of visual interest of lightness, of tension, and so on. We have the series of ramps introduced to bring people from the ground to the elevated level during construction. And this is seeing an area view, seeing the construction nearly done. The plants were still being cultivated. And in this kind of dialogue, if you will, a glass colonnades that was part of this waterfront connection design, together with the glass elevator or escalator attached to the silo building that was designed by another office, Atelier des House, who was responsible for renovating inside the silo building. So in that sense, the two projects more or less parallel each other and have a kind of dialogue, a visual and material and a kind of urban dialogue to each other. Together forms a kind of language of linearity, but also a kind of lineage of connection to the past, to the future, physical and metaphysical. So it's been a pleasure to have spent the last hour or so going through some 20 years of work and research and reflection. So I welcome you one day to have a visit to the beautiful city of Shanghai and to have a chance to come and visit us and to interact with the city, with our projects, and with the people here. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.